Grab your scrap bin because today I'm going to show you the absolute best way to use your fabric scraps. After this video, you will never throw away fabric scraps again. I save everything from unused quilt blocks to fabric from other projects, leftover binding, tiny scraps from trimming quilts, and even extra charm squares. Piecing tiny scraps can be so time consuming, but don't worry, this video has a trick that will change everything. The link in the description below includes this download and all the materials and supplies you need for this project. So grab your scrap bin and let's get started. Of course, we're going to need scraps, and then we're going to need this interfacing. This is grid interfacing. It has a printed 1-inch grid on the interfacing. This will be our trick to getting perfect patchwork, and I'll show you how to use it. You will also need cutting supplies. I love this rotating cutting mat. You can rotate it to get all sides of your fabric. And then you're going to need a pressing mat and an iron. Grab a scrap and we're going to start cutting. First, I like to square off 2 of the edges so that I have a nice clean corner to start with. And then we're going to cut squares and rectangles. The rectangles will be 2 inches by 1 inch and the squares will be 2 inches by 2 inches. To make cutting faster, you can stack your fabrics and cut multiple layers at once. Stack your scraps, lining them up in a corner, and then cut around your ruler, leaving excess along the edges that aren't even. Then you can rotate around and trim up the other sides to get your perfect squares. We are going to need 30 squares and 30 rectangles. Now cut a piece of your interfacing that'll be big enough for your project. Start with a piece bigger than you expect to account for seam allowances. Now lay this out on your pressing mat and grab a few scraps. Start by lining up a piece in the top corner using the grid to align it perfectly. The grid will help you lay these evenly as you go. Just make sure you're watching where your piece goes on the grid. The grid will help us get even seams even if we don't have perfectly cut squares or rectangles. Continue placing down 2-inch squares until you have 6 in a row. Then we're going to start up with the 2-inch by 1-inch rectangles, creating another column right next to that first one. Then we'll start back up at the top with 2-inch squares again. Continue this pattern until you have enough squares and rectangles down that you can fit your iron on top. It is a little tricky to keep them in place until you have heated them up to activate that fusible interfacing. So get them a little bit hot so you can tack them on there and then continue your pattern until you've used up all your squares. If your pieces happen to overlap a tiny bit or even have space in between them, it's going to be okay because we do have a 1/4-inch seam allowance for some extra give. So don't worry if there is a little extra space or overlap. Once you have finished using all of those scraps, we're going to give it another press and then trim around the edges. Now press again with your iron to make sure the edge pieces are secure. Flip it around to the back and press again from the back to get a really good press. Now we're going to start sewing. We're going to use this grid and the intersections along our rows to create the patchwork really quickly. So the first step is to fold along one of those rows or columns and press along where the fabric meets. Where the fabric meets will easily fold over, and then I just like to press it to hold it a little bit extra while I am sewing. Then go ahead and bring it to your sewing machine and sew down that folded edge with a 1/4-inch seam allowance. This interfacing is allowing us to sew 6 seams all at once. Press that seam allowance and then go on to the next intersection. You can start with either vertical or horizontal, but just make sure you're doing all of the rows in the same direction first before starting with the perpendicular seams. Once you have done all of that, give it a good press. You're going to see that all of my vertical seams are done, so we'll start doing the perpendicular seams. Before starting on the horizontal rows, turn the panel over and clip the seam allowances at the intersection. This will help us reduce the bulk of the seam allowances, especially since the interfacing is already making them extra bulky. After you clip them, we're going to press the seam allowances of each row in opposite directions. So leave the first row with the seam allowances pressed down and then press the second row up. This way, when we fold our rows to start sewing our horizontal seams, half of the seam allowance will go one way and half will go the other. That way we won't have 4 layers of fabric under one part of our patchwork. So you'll see when you fold up at the next intersection, the seam allowances are going in opposite directions, which will reduce our bulk. So now take it to your sewing machine and sew those horizontal seams. Pull that out from your sewing machine and you can see how perfect this patchwork is turning out. Continue sewing those horizontal rows until you have finished them all. Now press all the seam allowances in the same direction and then your patchwork panel is finished. This is a gorgeous piece of fabric that you can use to make any project. I used mine to make this zipper pouch I'm so thrilled about, but really the possibilities are endless. Thanks for sewing with me today. For more great sewing ideas, click above.